This is live recorded. I'm not going to edit any of this. Please bear with me, and I'll keep the introduction short. I will read the first part of Notes on Nationalism, which I deem to be the most important one. And since I deem this one of the most important works for the current day, and present might be the better word, that is often neglected by so many. While this is such a tiny little work, you can get this, for example, from Penguin Press. They have a series called Modern. This is number 7. And allegedly, at least on the back, it says it costs £1. On Amazon, I think it's 3 or 4. But it's worth having it in your library. It's a very quick read. It is about 50 pages on A5. No, A6 even. Which would mean 25 on A5, which would probably mean about a dozen pages on A4. This is doable in a day, I think, or on the toilet. Anyway, for those who have had long conversations, discussions with me, may notice some similarities to the ideas I came up with, and I am very thankful to find backing in Orwell's old realizations. I believe he did not, at least in this work, he did not further develop his thoughts simply due to the lack of what he could witness. We now today have way more evidence and examples, also thanks to the internet connecting us more and showing us more of these instances. And of course, we have more ideologies to map out and analyze, where we all see the same structures happening. I should try to get to the point. Do not overlook this work. It is a quick read. Do it. And this is why I am now doing this recording. For those who either can't find an ebook of that, I'm not looking into ebook, audiobook. I'm not looking into those. Generally, I prefer to read. So I don't know if there's one out. There's probably one out there. But I'm doing this mainly for my friends here. There are a few footnotes, and they are written in a way that I will just incorporate them into the text itself. And refrain mostly from making further comments, except in the very beginning. The very first sentence has something on this that I need to expand a little bit on. And the way Orwell uses the word nationalism, for lack of a better word, I do not think we have a proper word in any language, at least not one known to me. If you have linguistic versed friends, maybe a couple polyglots out there, maybe someone knows a language that has a word for the concept we try to describe, for we need a proper word for this. Tribalism might be closer to it, but even that doesn't cut it properly. Tribalism is an element of it, but it's not the thing. I also like that Orwell goes to a degree of explaining the differences between nationalism and patriotism, which I had to figure out on my own when I was on the street for a while, but I drift off onto the text. Notes on Nationalism by George Orwell. This is the first essay. There are 3 essays in this. Somewhere or other, Byron makes use of the French word longueur, and remarks in passing that though in England we happen not to have the word, we have the thing in considerable profusion. I looked up. I did not take French in school. I had to take Russian, to my disgrace. And well, disgrace not. But you know what I mean. I looked up the word longueur. It seems to refer to length or lengths and lanes, like on a running track, mainly. And I am not entirely sure how this fits more, but I think we see it reflected in the stay in your lane meme. However, I do not think that this French word either is describing this issue, or where I looked it up, lacks this extra connotation. However, if you happen to know someone who knows a language with a word that fits the concept we try to describe, at the very least since George Orwell or even Byron, out with it. On with the text. In the same way, there is a habit of mind which is now so widespread that it affects our thinking on nearly every subject, but which has not yet been given a name. As the nearest existing equivalent, I have chosen the word nationalism. But it will be seen in a moment that I am not using it in quite the ordinary sense, if only because the emotion I am speaking about does not always attach itself to what is called a nation, that is, a single race or a geographical area. It can attach itself to a church or a class, or it may work in a merely negative sense against something or other and without the need for any positive object or loyalty. One more thing I want to add is that I have not looked up every single word's pronunciation in this that I was unsure about. I just want to get this over with because I wanted to do this days ago. Those who know about my health may excuse me. By nationalism, I mean first of all the habit of assuming that human beings can be classified like insects, and that whole blocks of millions or tens of millions of people can be confidently labeled good or bad. Nations and even vaguer entities such as the Catholic Church or the proletariat are commonly thought of as individuals and often referred to as she. Patently absurd remarks such as "Germany is naturally treacherous" are to be found in any newspaper one opens, and reckless generalizations about national character. "The Spaniard is a natural aristocrat," or "every Englishman is a hypocrite," are uttered by almost everyone. Intermittently, these generalizations are seen to be unfounded, but the habit of making them persists, and people of professedly international outlook, for example Tolstoy or Bernard Shaw, are often guilty of them. I never looked up e.g. and i.e. I think e.g. is in exemplar, which is for example. E.g. also means for example, but I never looked it up. My bad. This was an e.g. I will just use for example when I come across these. But secondly, and this is much more important, I mean the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. Nationalism is not to be confused with patriotism. Both words are normally used in so vague a way that any definition is liable to be challenged. But one must draw a distinction between them, since two different and even opposing ideas are involved. My bad. By patriotism, I mean devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force upon other people. Patriotism is of its nature defensive, both militarily and culturally. Nationalism, on the other hand, is inseparable from the desire for power. The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation or other unit in which he has chosen to sink his own individuality. Personal note: what we see of this type of nationalism of the radical left, of socialists, seems it's in its destruction is the destruction of patriotism in any local unit that they seek to overtake, so that any defenses are lost. It takes away destroying patriotism is taking away the defensive capabilities of a people. But back to Orwell. So long as it is applied merely to the more notorious and identifiable nationalist movements in Germany, Japan, and other countries, all this is obvious enough. Confronted with a phenomenon like Nazism, which we can observe from the outside, nearly all of us would say much the same things about it. But here I must repeat what I said above, that I am only using the word nationalism for lack of a better. Nationalism, in the extended sense in which I am using the word, includes such movements and tendencies as communism, political Catholicism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, Trotskyism, and pacifism. It does not necessarily mean loyalty to a government or a country, still less to one's own country, and it is not even strictly necessary that the units in which it deals should actually exist. To name a few obvious examples, Jewry, Islam, Christendom, the proletariat, and the white race are all of them the objects of passionate nationalistic feeling. But their existence... Oh, this is embarrassing. That was my lunch break alarm. I'm sorry. Where was I? Right. They are all of them the objects of passionate nationalistic feeling. But their existence can be seriously questioned, and there is no definition of any one of them that would be universally accepted. It is also worth emphasizing once again that nationalist feeling can be purely negative. There are, for example, Trotskyists who have become simply the enemies of the USSR, without developing a corresponding loyalty to any other unit. When one grasps the implications of this, the nature of what I mean by nationalism becomes a good deal clearer. A nationalist is one who thinks solely or mainly in terms of competitive prestige. He may be a positive or a negative nationalist. That is, he may use his mental energy either in boosting or in denigrating. But at any rate, his thoughts always turn on victories, defeats, triumphs, and humiliations. He sees history, especially contemporary history, as the endless rise and decline of great power units, and every event that happens seems to him a demonstration that his own side is on the upgrade and some hated rival on the downgrade. But finally, it is important not to confuse nationalism with mere worship of success. The nationalist does not go on the principle of simply ganging up with the strongest side. On the contrary, having picked his side, he persuades himself that it is the strongest, and is able to stick to his belief even when the facts are overwhelmingly against him. Nationalism is power hunger tempered by self-deception. Every nationalist is capable of the most flagrant dishonesty, but he is also, since he is conscious of serving something bigger than himself, unshakably certain of being in the right. Now that I have given this lengthy definition, I think it will be admitted that the habit of mind I am talking about is widespread among the English intelligentsia, and more widespread there than among the mass of the people. For those who feel deeply about contemporary politics, certain topics have become so infected by considerations of prestige that a genuinely rational approach to them is almost impossible. Out of the hundreds of examples that one might choose, take this question. Which of the three great allies, the USSR, Britain, and the USA, has contributed most to the defeat of Germany? In theory, it should be possible to give a reasoned and perhaps even a conclusive answer to this question. In practice, however, the necessary calculations cannot be made, because anyone likely to bother his head about such a question would inevitably see it in terms of competitive prestige. He would therefore start by deciding in favor of Russia, Britain, or America, as the case might be, and only after this would begin searching for arguments that seem to support his case. And there are whole strings of kindred questions to which you can only get an honest answer from someone who is indifferent to the whole subject involved, and whose opinion on it is probably worthless in any case. Hence, partly, the remarkable failure in our time of political and military prediction. It is curious to reflect that out of all the experts of all the schools, there was not a single one who was able to foresee so likely an event as the Russo-German Pact of 1939. A reminder, as I forgot in the beginning, as I do, these essays of Notes on Nationalism were all written in 1945. I think still before the end of the war. Back to the text. A few writers of conservative tendencies, such as Peter Drucker, foretold an agreement between Germany and Russia, but they expected an actual alliance or amalgamation which would be permanent. No Marxist or other left-wing writer of whatever color came anywhere near foretelling the pact. And when the news of the pact broke, the most wildly divergent explanations of it were given, and predictions were made which were falsified almost immediately, being based in nearly every case not on a study of probabilities, but on a desire to make the USSR seem good or bad, strong or weak. Political or military commentators, like astrologers, can survive almost any mistake, because their more devoted followers do not look to them for an appraisal of the facts, but for the stimulation of nationalistic loyalties. The military commentators of the popular press can mostly be classified as pro-Russian or anti-Russian, pro-blimp or anti-blimp. Such errors as believing the Maginot Line impregnable or predicting that Russia would conquer Germany in 3 months have failed to shake their reputation because they were always saying that their own particular audience wanted to hear. What their own particular audience wanted to hear. The two military critics most favored by the intelligentsia are Captain Liddell Hart and Major General Fuller, the first of whom teaches that the defense is stronger than the attack, and the second that the attack is stronger than the defense. This contradiction has not prevented both of them from being accepted as authorities by the same public. The secret reason for their vogue in left-wing circles is that both of them are at odds with the War Office. And back to the main text, this was a footnote. And aesthetic judgments, especially literary judgments, are often corrupted in the same way as political ones. It would be difficult for an Indian nationalist to enjoy reading Kipling, or for a conservative to see merit in Mayakovsky. And there is always a temptation to claim that any book whose tendency one disagrees with must be a bad book from a literary point of view. People of strongly nationalistic outlook often perform this sleight of hand without being conscious of dishonesty. In England, if one simply considers the number of people involved, it is probable that the dominant form of nationalism is old-fashioned British jingoism. It is certain that this is still widespread. and much more so than observers would have believed a dozen years ago. However, in this essay, I am concerned chiefly with the reactions of the intelligentsia, among whom jingoism and even patriotism of the old kind are almost dead, though they now seem to be reviving among a minority. Among the intelligentsia, it hardly needs saying that the dominant form of nationalism is communism. Using this word in a very loose sense, to include not merely Communist Party members, but fellow travelers and Russophiles generally. A communist, for my purpose here, is one who looks upon the USSR as his fatherland and feels it his duty to justify Russian policy and advance Russian interests at all costs. Obviously, such people abound in England today, and the direct and indirect influence is very great. But many other forms of nationalism also flourish, and it is by noticing the points of resemblance between different and even seemingly opposed currents of thought that one can best get the matter into perspective. 10 or 20 years ago, the form of nationalism most closely corresponding to communism today was political Catholicism. Its most outstanding exponent, though he was perhaps an extreme case rather than a typical one, was G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was a writer of considerable talent who chose to suppress both his sensibilities and his intellectual honesty in the cause of Roman Catholic propaganda. During the last 20 years or so of his life, his entire output was in reality an endless repetition of the same thing, under its labored cleverness as simple and boring as "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Every book that he wrote, every paragraph, every sentence, every incident in every story, every scrap of dialogue had to demonstrate beyond possibility of mistake the superiority of the Catholic over the Protestant or the pagan. But Chesterton was not content to think of this superiority as merely intellectual or spiritual. It had to be translated into terms of national prestige and military power, which entailed an ignorant idealization of the Latin countries, especially France. Chesterton had not lived long in France, and his picture of it as a land of Catholic peasants incessantly singing the Marseillaise over glasses of red wine had about as much relation to reality as Chu Chin Chow has to everyday life in Baghdad. And with this went not only an enormous overestimation of French military power, both before and after 1914-18 he maintained that France by itself was stronger than Germany, but a silly and vulgar glorification of the actual process of war. Chesterton's battle poems such as Lepanto or The Ballad of St. Barbara make The Charge of the Light Brigade read like a pacifist tract. They are perhaps the most tawdry bits of bombast to be found in our language. The interesting thing is that had the romantic rubbish which he habitually wrote about France and the French army been written by somebody else about Britain and the British army, he would have been the first to jeer. In home politics, you English people, you definitely need more compound words again. Man. In home politics, he was a little Englander, a true hater of jingoism and imperialism, and according to his lights, a true friend of democracy. Yet when he looked outwards into the international field, he could forsake his principles without even noticing that he was doing so. Thus, his almost mystical belief in the virtues of democracy did not prevent him from admiring Mussolini. Mussolini had destroyed the representative government and the freedom of the press for which Chesterton had struggled so hard at home. But Mussolini was an Italian and had made Italy strong, and that settled the matter. Nor did Chesterton ever find a word to say against imperialism and the conquest of colored races when they were practiced by Italians or Frenchmen. his hold on reality, his literary taste, and even to some extent his moral sense were dislocated as soon as his nationalistic loyalties were involved. Obviously, there are considerable resemblances between political Catholicism, as exemplified by Chesterton, and communism. So there are between either of these and, for instance, Scottish nationalism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, or Trotskyism. It would be an oversimplification to say that all forms of nationalism are the same, even in their mental atmosphere, but there are certain rules that hold good in all cases. The following are the principal characteristics of nationalist thought. I want to take a short break here as my mouth is drying up. Sorry. And before I forget the thoughts, interject that I believe the parallels to today, and also some things that don't seem to have changed much, as the prevalence of communism within the intelligentsia in the Western world, the alleged non-communist world, does not seem to have changed. It has changed. It has morphed slightly, I would say, at best. In the sense of the Russophile, I noticed something very, very odd at first, especially for the Americans, even for the Democratic Party and the viewers of CNN. Russia still seems to be the enemy. That is still a thing. Even for the communists, somehow Russia is the enemy. While at the same time, while I think the nationalism described here by Orwell has shifted towards China, for nothing that China does is ever considered bad or will be swept under the rug. For China was made strong through whatever they did, while they have the hammer and sickle as their logo. Would they have any other logo, the communist nationalists, or you could also, favoritism is also a word, but I think it's too weak. They would not support China. But it is done with the symbol, and they are nationalistic to the symbol of communism. Maybe they are not nationalistic to communism, but just the symbol that represents it. And as long as you plaster that symbol onto you, they will believe anything you say or think you're good. It's a bit more complicated than that, of course, especially with their infighting and purity spiraling. But in general, that seems to be what's going on. Need some more caffeine, and we'll get into the gist of it. And by the way, the same structure you will also find in every personality cult, as when they take over your hobby, for example, or your little association that you founded, your hobby association, hobby group, or whatever else. They are. Oh, this is what I wanted to say in the beginning. In what I came to before I came across Orwell's work here was that I came up with a very esoteric sounding idea that felt right, but I couldn't really nail it yet. And I failed to do the legwork. I hope you can forgive me on that. But that is that I kept saying for a long time, years at this point, that people like communists, whether you use communists as the example or neo-Nazis, they are nationalistic. They are nationalists. But neo-Nazis, for example, are not nationalistic to Germany. Not really. They are nationalistic towards their idea of Germany, which includes where the borders should be, not where they are. And their version of what should be, not the country itself. and not the principles on which it is founded that currently should make it up. That would be patriotism, standing for the principles of your country, instead of blindly for the country. The communists, and this is the maybe the clearer example, especially in the Western world, they are nationalistic towards the communist state. But there is no communist state right now, is there? No. But they seek to found it. They seek to establish it. And once they have that, all the freedoms they are abusing right now will be gone. And I believe we have seen more than enough evidence, at least the Americans finally have seen more than enough evidence with their little autonomous zones that are nothing but, essentially nothing but colonies of another ideology. It is another nation. But it is one that is not yet established. And this whole squatter scene is something that was very normal to Germany. So for me, when I saw the images of the chairs, I saw nothing new. I saw something I recognized from several places in Germany. This is just normal. This has been done here since the 80s. And maybe, because this is so new and chaotic, that the Americans were simply too baffled by it. I don't think the Americans need ever to fear a threat from the outside, for the immune system is primed to that. That is where a gun behind every blade of grass probably works. Where I can believe that might work. If there was an invading army coming in, yeah, that might work. But what the American people are incapable of finding is an enemy from within, despite all the fiction that tackles exactly these issues. But the blade, the weapon, the gun behind every blade of grass is unable to fight the enemy from within, because it cannot even detect the enemy from within, because on paper those are all Americans. Not in spirit, not in mind. In mind they are anti-Americans, just like the left in Germany is anti-German, and the left in Britain is anti-British, and the left in France is anti-France. At least some of it is. France is a little special in those regards. However, Orwell, I think, will go deeper into the the nationalist that is anti the thing that is there, the negative nationalism that he mentioned. Anyway, I just wanted to interject this. Let the caffeine sink in. And let's go through with this. So, the following are the principal characteristics of nationalist thought. Number 1. Obsession. As nearly as possible, no nationalist ever thinks, talks, or writes about anything except the superiority of his own power unit. It is difficult, if not impossible, for any nationalist to conceal his allegiance. The smallest slur upon his own unit or any implied praise of a rival organization fills him with uneasiness, which can only relieve by making some sharp retort. If the chosen unit is an actual country, such as Ireland or India, he will generally claim superiority for it not only in military power and political virtue, but in art, literature, sport, the structure of the language, the physical beauty of the inhabitants, and perhaps even in climate, scenery, and cooking. He will show great sensitiveness about such things. About such things as the correct display of flags, relative size of headlines, and the order in which different countries are named. Certain Americans have expressed dissatisfaction because Anglo-American is the normal form of combination of these two words. It has been proposed to substitute Americo-British. Ugh. Oh dear. Nomenclature plays a very important part in nationalist thought. Countries which have won their independence or gone through a nationalist revolution usually change their names, and any country or other unit round. Oh my god, you need compound words. And any country or other unit round which strong feelings revolve is. It probably meant around. You got some slang in your text, Mr. Orwell. Okay, all right. Again. Countries which have won their independence or gone through a nationalist revolution usually change their names, and any country or other unit around which strong feelings revolve is likely to have several names, each of them carrying a different implication. The two sides in the Spanish Civil War had between them 9 or 10 names expressing different degrees of love and hatred. Some of these names, for example, patriots or for Franco supporters, or loyalists for government supporters, were frankly question-begging, and there was no single one of them which the two rival factions could have agreed to use. All nationalists consider it a duty to spread their own language to the detriment of rival languages. Interject thoughts about Newspeak here. And among English speakers, this struggle reappears in subtler form as a struggle between dialects. Anglophobe Americans will refuse to use a slang phrase if they know it to be British, of British origin, and the conflict between Latinizers and Germanizers often has nationalist motives behind it. Scottish nationalists insist on the superiority of lowland Scots, and socialists, whose nationalism takes the form of class hatred, tirade against the BBC accent and even the broad A. One could multiply instances. Nationalist thought often gives the impression of being tinged by belief in sympathetic magic, a belief which probably comes out in the widespread custom of burning political enemies in effigy or using pictures of them as targets in shooting at galleries. Number 2 of principal characteristics of nationalist thought: instability. The intensity with which they are held does not prevent nationalist loyalties from being transferable. To begin with, as I have pointed out already, they can be and often are fastened upon some foreign country. One quite commonly finds that great national leaders or the founders of nationalist movements do not even belong to the country they have glorified. Sometimes they are outright foreigners, or more often they come from peripheral areas where nationality is doubtful. Examples are Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, De Valera, Disraeli, Boinga, I have no idea how to pronounce that, Beaverbrook. The Pan-German movement was in part the creation of an Englishman, Euston Chamberlain. For the past 50 or 100 years, transferred nationalism has been a common phenomenon among literary intellectuals. With Lafcadio Hearn, the transference was to Japan, with Carlyle and many others of his time to Germany. And in our own age, it is usually to Russia. But peculiarly, in our own age means 1945. In the present day of this recording, it is probably China. But a peculiarly interesting fact is that retransference is also possible. A country or other unit which has been worshipped for years may suddenly become detestable, and some other object of affection may take its place with almost no interval. In the first version of H.G. Wells' Outline of History and others of his writings about that time, one finds the United States praised almost as extravagantly as Russia is praised by communists today. Yet within a few years, this uncritical admiration had turned into hostility. The bigoted communist who changes in a space of weeks or even days into an equally bigoted Trotskyist is a common spectacle. In continental Europe, fascist movements were largely recruited from among communists. And the opposite process may well happen within the new few years. Interjection. That is what commonly happens in the neo-Nazi and Antifa groups in Germany, where the same staff switches over from one to the other. This is a common occurrence. What remains constant in the nationalist is his own state of mind. The object of his feelings is changeable and may be imaginary. But for an intellectual, transference has an important function, which I have already mentioned shortly in connection with Chesterton. It makes it possible for him to be much more nationalistic, more vulgar, more silly, more malignant, more dishonest than he could ever be on behalf of his native country, or any unit of which he had real knowledge. When one sees the slavish or boastful rubbish that is written about Stalin, the Red Army, etc., by fairly intelligent and sensitive people, one realizes that this is only possible because some kind of dislocation has taken place. In societies such as ours, it is unusual for anyone describable as an intellectual to feel a very deep attachment to his own country. Public opinion, that is, the section of public opinion of which he as an intellectual is aware. That is, the section of public opinion of which he as an intellectual is aware, will not allow him to do so. Most of the people surrounding him are skeptical and disaffected, and he may adopt the same attitude from imitativeness or sheer cowardice. In that case, he will have abandoned the form of nationalism that lies nearest to hand without getting any closer to a genuinely internationalist outlook. He still feels the need for a fatherland, and it is natural to look for one somewhere abroad. Having found it, he can wallow unrestrainedly in exactly those emotions from which he believes that he has emancipated himself. God, the King, the Empire, the Union Jack. All the overthrown idols can reappear under different names, and because they are not recognized for what they are, they can be worshipped with a good conscience. Transferred nationalism, like the use of scapegoats, is a way of attaining salvation without altering one's conduct. I believe part of it is peer pressure. And this is maybe more for the commoner than the intelligentsia. That is where the peer pressure tribalism comes into play, where you just follow the flock of the herd because that is the easiest way of life. The intelligentsia Orwell describes seems to be unaware in a different way. I failed to put this into words right now. So I have to apologize for this interjection before the next bit. The third principal characteristic of nationalist thought, which Orwell identifies as an, drum roll please, indifference to reality. All nationalists have the power of not seeing resemblances between similar sets of facts. A British Tory will defend self-determination in Europe and oppose it in India with no feeling of inconsistency. Actions are held to be good or bad not on their own merits, but according to who does them. And there is almost no kind of outrage. Torture, the use of hostages, forced labor, mass deportations, imprisonment without trial, forgery, assassination, the bombing of civilians, which does not change its moral color when it is committed by our side. Sorry. The Liberal News Chronicle published, as an example of shocking barbarity, photographs of Russians hanged by the Germans, and then a year or two later published with warm approval almost exactly similar photographs of Germans hanged by the Russians. The News Chronicle advised its readers to visit a news film at which the entire execution could be witnessed, with close-ups. The Star published with seeming approval photographs of nearly naked female collaborationists being baited by the Paris mob. These photographs had a marked resemblance to the Nazi photographs of Jews being baited by the Berlin mob. It is the same with historical events. History is thought of largely in nationalist terms. And such things as the Inquisition, the tortures of the Star Chamber, the exploits of the English buccaneers, Sir Francis Drake, for example, who was given to sinking Spanish prisoners alive, the Reign of Terror, the heroes of the mutiny blowing hundreds of Indians from guns, or Cromwell's soldiers slashing Irishwomen's faces with razors, become morally neutral or even meritorious when it is felt that they were done in the right cause. If one looks back over the past quarter of a century, one finds that there was hardly a single year when atrocity stories were not being reported from some part of the world. And yet in not one single case were these atrocities in Spain, Russia, China, Hungary, Mexico, Amritsar, Smyrna, believed in and disapproved of by the English intelligentsia as a whole. Whether such deeds were reprehensible or even whether they happened was always decided according to political predilection. The nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. For quite 6 years, the English admirers of Hitler contrived not to learn of the existence of Dachau and Buchenwald, and those who are loudest in denouncing the German concentration camps are often quite unaware, only very dimly aware, that there are also concentration camps in Russia. Huge events like the Ukraine famine of 1933, involving the deaths of millions of people, have actually escaped the attention of the majority of English Russophiles. Many English people have heard almost nothing about the extermination of German and Polish Jews during the present war. Their own anti-Semitism has caused this vast crime to bounce off their consciousness. In nationalist thought, there are facts which are both true and untrue, known and unknown. A known fact may be so unbearable that it is habitually pushed aside and not allowed to enter into logical processes. Or, on the other hand, it may enter into every calculation and yet never be admitted as a fact, even in one's own mind. Every nationalist is haunted by the belief that the past can be altered. He spends part of his time in a fantasy world in which things happen as they should, in which, for example, the Spanish Armada was a success or the Russian Revolution was crushed in 1918. And he will transfer fragments of this world to the history books whenever possible. Much of the propagandist writing of our time amounts to plain forgery. Material facts are suppressed, dates altered, quotations removed from their context and doctored so as to change their meaning. Events which, it is felt, ought not to have happened are left unmentioned and ultimately denied. An example is the Russo-German Pact, which is being effaced as quickly as possible from public memory, A Russian correspondent informs me that mention of the pact is already being omitted from Russian yearbooks which table recent political events. This was in 1945. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek boiled hundreds of communists alive, and yet within 10 years he had become one of the heroes of the left. The realignment of world politics had brought him into the anti-fascist camp, and so it was felt that the boiling of the communists didn't count, or perhaps had not happened. The primary aim of propaganda is, of course, to influence contemporary opinion, but those who rewrite history do probably believe with part of their minds that they are actually thrusting facts into the past. When one considers the elaborate forgeries that have been committed in order to show that Trotsky did not play a valuable part in the Russian Civil War, it is difficult to feel that the people responsible are merely lying. More probably, they feel that their own version was what happened in the sight of God, and that one is justified in rearranging the records accordingly. Indifference to objective truth is encouraged by the sealing off of one part of the world from another, which makes it harder and harder to discover what is actually happening. There can often be a genuine doubt about the most enormous events. For example, it is possible to calculate within millions, perhaps even tens of millions, the number of deaths caused by the present war. The calamities that are constantly being reported, battles, massacres, famines, revolutions, tend to inspire in the average person a feeling of unreality. One has no way of verifying the facts, one is not even fully certain that they have happened, and one is always presented with totally different interpretations from different sources. What were the rights and wrongs of the Warsaw Rising of August 1944? Is it true about the German gas ovens in Poland? Who was really to blame for the Bengal famine? Probably the truth is discoverable, but the facts will be so dishonestly set forth in almost any newspaper that the ordinary reader can be forgiven either for swallowing lies or for failing to form an opinion. The general uncertainty as to what is really happening makes it easier to cling to lunatic beliefs. Since nothing is ever quite proved or disproved, the most unmistakable fact can be impudently denied. Moreover, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, revenge, the nationalist is often somewhat uninterested in what happens in the real world. What he wants is to feel that his own unit is getting the better of some other unit, and he can more easily do this by scoring off an adversary than by examining the facts to see whether they support him. All nationalist controversy is at the debating society level. It is always entirely inconclusive, since each contestant invariably believes himself to have won the victory. Some nationalists are not far from schizophrenia, living quite happily amid dreams of power and conquest which have no connection with the physical world. Here's something else comes to mind, as some of my friends are aware, dig quite deep into certain psychological issues. Narcissism and the spectrum that tails off of it being one of them. Narcissism is in part defined by an emotional immaturity, and often a disjunction with reality and the facts it presents, and what a narcissist believes reality to be, especially about him or herself, which is where others have merely cognitive dissonance. The narcissist may throw a tantrum like a 5-year-old child. For the narcissist, the full personality disorder, and its derivatives like borderline, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy, if you will, also espouse these elements. And that is because emotionally, in the emotional development, these people are only 5 years old. Every human goes through a narcissistic phase. These are the basic social functions we develop. And if we are under too much stress, we all fall back into them, for they require the least amount of mental energy. They are, for a normal human being, an emergency basic operating system, if you will. For a narcissist, it is the everyday, and that is where it becomes dangerous. You could say a human in an absolute emergency situation of absolute psychological stress or physical abandonment has to be egotistical. I believe we can make an argument for that. But when a normal human gets better again and regains mental processing power and capacity, he comes back out of the narcissistic emergency routines, if you will. The narcissist, however, never left them to begin with, never developed anything beyond them. Even though some are very good at faking being adults, they are not. They are fake it till you make it, without the make it. But you may think I'm drifting off here, but if you look into these issues, you will find a lot of resemblance with especially the current radical left youth, up until their 20s and even 30s at this point, as emotional immaturity, whether you want to give a full diagnostic accusation of narcissistic personality disorder and the others, is prevalent in that area. And I believe this part is always present within the population, for it seems that a lot of people never develop an order of consciousness beyond what you have in your teenage years. And what we really need is of many other things, is a way to figure out how to, one, filter for emotional maturity, and secondly, figure out how to trigger young people or any underdeveloped people into developing the emotional maturity that they still lack. Second point before I move on with the text, I am almost through, I think, yes. Is when I mentioned I mentioned the personality cult. The smallest cult of personality is a narcissistic relationship, which is always an abusive relationship. That is just two people, the narcissist at the center of the personality cult, and, well, the emotional resource the narcissist is exploiting and very quickly removed any spine off that might have been present ever before. The victim in the narcissistic relationship, usually someone you could describe as an empath, is essentially nationalistic about the abuser, the narcissistic abuser in the relationship. As all the descriptions of nationalism that Orwell used here would be true for the narcissistic abuse victim that is still in denial about the abuse itself. If you were annoyed by this distraction, my bad. These thoughts tend to I can't hold them all anymore for until I am done with a project. My health issues just prevent me from that today. Before all this shit happened, I had no trouble doing such things, and now I feel like I'm just a dumb idiot. Because of what I could do before and what now I can't. But that's another story. Back to Orwell. I have examined as best I can the mental habits which are common to all forms of nationalism. The next thing is to classify those forms. But obviously, this cannot be done comprehensively. Nationalism is an enormous subject. The world is tormented by innumerable delusions and hatreds which cut across one another in an extremely complex way, and some of the most sinister of them have not yet even impinged on the European consciousness. In this essay, I am concerned with nationalism as it occurs among the English intelligentsia. In them, much more often than in ordinary English people, it is unmixed with patriotism, and can therefore be studied pure. Below are listed the varieties of nationalism now, 1945, flourishing among English intellectuals, with such comments as seem to be needed. It is convenient to use three headings: positive, transferred, and negative, though some varieties will fit into more than one category. Positive nationalism. Example 1. Neo-Toryism. Exemplified by such people as Lord Elton, A.P. Herbert, G.M. Young, Professor Pickthorne, by the literature of the Tory Reform Committee, and by such magazines as the New English Review and the 19th Century and After. The real motive force of Neo-Toryism, giving it its nationalistic character and differentiating it from ordinary conservatism, is the desire not to recognize that British power and influence have declined. Even those who are realistic enough to see that Britain's military position is not what it was tend to claim that English ideas, usually left undefined, must dominate the world. All neo-Tories are anti-Russian, but sometimes the main emphasis is anti-American. The significant thing is that this school of thought seems to be gaining ground among, there was a typo, I'm sorry, seem to be gaining ground among youngish intellectuals, sometimes ex-communists who have passed through the usual process of disillusionment and become disillusioned with that. The Anglophobe who suddenly becomes violently pro-British is a fairly common figure. Writers who illustrate this tendency are F.A. Vogt, Malcolm Muggeridge, Evelyn Waugh, Hugh Kingsmill, and a psychologically similar development can be observed in T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, and various of their followers. Example 2. Celtic nationalism. Welsh, Irish, and Scottish nationalism have points of difference, but are alike in their anti-English orientation. Members of all three movements have opposed the war, while continuing to describe themselves as pro-Russian. And the lunatic fringe has even contrived to be simultaneously pro-Russian and pro-Nazi. But Celtic nationalism is not the same thing as Anglophobia. Its motive force is a belief in the past and future greatness of the Celtic peoples, and it has a strong tinge of racialism. The Celt is supposed to be spiritually superior to the Saxon, simpler, more creative, less vulgar, less snobbish. Scots being less vulgar than British? Alright, I don't know everything that you do on your island, but that messes with my stereotypes. Oh dear. But the usual power hunger is there under the surface. One symptom of it is the delusion that Eire, it's probably a word for Ireland, Scotland or even Wales could preserve its independence unaided and owes nothing to British protection. Among writers, good examples of this school of thought are Hugh MacDiarmid and Sean O'Casey. No modern Irish writer, even of the stature of Yeats or Joyce, is completely free from traces of nationalism. Example 3. Zionism. This has the usual characteristics of a nationalist movement, but the American variant of it seems to be more violent and malignant than the British. I classify it under direct and not transferred nationalism because it flourishes almost exclusively among the Jews themselves. In England, for several rather incongruous reasons, the intelligentsia are mostly pro-Jew on the Palestine issue, but they do not feel strongly about it. All English people of goodwill are also pro-Jew in the sense of disapproving of Nazi persecution. But any actual nationalistic loyalty or belief in the innate superiority of Jews is hardly to be found among Gentiles. Second topic, transferred nationalism. Examples: 1. Communism. 2. Political Catholicism. 3. Color feeling. The old-style contemptuous attitude towards natives has been much weakened in England, and various pseudoscientific theories emphasizing the superiority of the white race have been abandoned. A good example is the sunstroke superstition. Until recently, it was believed that white races were more liable to sunstroke than the colored, and that a white man could not safely walk about in tropical sunshine without a pith helmet. There was no evidence whatsoever for this theory, but it served the purpose of accentuating the difference between natives and Europeans. During the present war, the theory has been quietly dropped, and whole armies maneuver in the tropics without pith helmets. So long as the sunstroke superstition survived, English doctors in India appear to have believed in it as firmly as laymen. I have heard different about this in regards to slaves in the Caribbean. That was also hard labor. I do not know how these come up. This was the first time I heard this contested. So I can't really make up any real opinion on that without doing the legwork, which I am not doing right now. Bad me. Among the intelligentsia, color feeling only occurs in the transposed form, that is, as a belief in the innate superiority of the colored races. This is now increasingly common among English intellectuals, probably resulting more often from masochism and sexual frustration than from contact with the Oriental and Negro nationalist movements. Even among those who do not feel strongly on the color question, snobbery and imitation have a powerful influence. Almost any English intellectual would be scandalized by the claim that the white races are superior to the colored, whereas the opposite claim would seem to him unexceptionable even if he disagreed with it. Nationalistic attachment to the colored races is usually mixed up with the belief that their sex lives are superior. And there is a large underground mythology about the sexual prowess of the Negroes. And you thought this was a new thing. Example 4. Class feeling. Among upper class and middle class intellectuals, only in the transposed on the topic before. This is why I call it political and racist and race fetishism. Number 4, class feeling. Among upper class and middle class intellectuals, only in the transposed form. In exemplary, as a belief in the superiority of the proletariat. Here again, inside intelligentsia, the pressure of public opinion is overwhelming. Nationalistic loyalty towards the proletariat and most vicious theoretical hatred of the bourgeoisie can and often do coexist with ordinary snobbishness in everyday life. Example 5 of transferred nationalism. Pacifism. The majority of pacifists either belong to obscure religious sects or are simply humanitarians who object to taking life and prefer not to follow their thoughts beyond that point. But there is a minority of intellectual pacifists whose real, though admitted, But there is a minority of intellectual pacifists whose real, though unadmitted, motive appears to be hatred of Western democracy and admiration for totalitarianism. Pacifist propaganda usually boils down to saying that one side is as bad as the other, but if one looks closely at the writings of the younger intellectual pacifists, one finds that they do not by any means impress impartial disapproval, but are directed almost entirely against Britain and the United States. Moreover, they do not as a rule condemn violence as such, but only violence used in defense of the Western countries. The Russians, unlike the British, are not blamed for defending themselves by warlike means, and indeed all pacifist propaganda of this type avoids mention of Russia or China. It is not claimed, again, that the Indians should abjure violence in their struggle against the British. Pacifist literature abounds with equivocal remarks, if they mean anything, appear to mean that statesmen of the type of Hitler are preferable to those of the type of Churchill, and that violence is perhaps excusable if it is violent enough. After the fall of France, the French pacifists, faced by a real choice which their English colleagues have not had to make, mostly went over to the Nazis. And in England, there appears to have been some small overlap of membership between the Peace Pledge Union and the Black Shirts. Pacifist writers have written in praise of Carlyle, one of the intellectual fathers of fascism. All in all, it is difficult not to feel that pacifism, as it appears among a section of the intelligentsia, is secretly inspired by an admiration for power and successful cruelty. The mistake was made of pinning this emotion to Hitler, but it could easily be transferred. This is a very special topic as sorry, my mouth is drying up. This is a very special topic, as you will find this very sentiment that was just described, this type of radical pacifism or one-sided pacifism. I don't know, because this doesn't sound like pacifism. There's an element of it in there, but it is twisted and warped. It is not defensive, as it should be. Like what was it? Like patriotism. And you will find this in your schools, where your children go. You will find it with the teachers who forced the bully victim to make up with the bully and then scold the bully victim for not acknowledging the forced and never honestly meant apology, the empty words of the bully. And those kinds of teachers will then tell the bully victim that he's not better than the bully for some reason or another. For these teachers also are cowards and they never reprimand the bully. They go for a soft target. They are bullies themselves and are not conscious of it. They're the cowards that will terrorize you. And they are very important to any dictatorship to be built. They're the cowards who enforce the worst of laws. But before it comes to that, to remain in this school example, this is something that happened to me as well, and many of these things resemble what I don't want to sound theatralic, but what lots of physical and mainly psychological, but some also physical abuse by teachers in my school, my elementary school especially, looked like. And this is one of the main factors. Another is, of course, a lack of support of the family. But this here in school is these kinds of teachers are a bigger factor in creating school shooters and suicide and children committing suicide than the actual bullies. Because these are the authorities that are supposed to clean up the mess, to restore the order of the world. And instead, they reprimand you for having been bullied. Like, they will say that, oh, but why are you associating with him, with your bully or her, if he's bullying you? And this is one of these insane, almost gaslighting, I think it is gaslighting, questions that a bully victim is then faced with, and will answer in a justifiably hysterical manner that I'm not seeking him out, he's coming to me. And then almost breaking my arm or sitting on my head and the like. Or punching me constantly. And the pacifism element comes into play because these same teachers will hammer into you that you are not to retaliate against the bully who only understands physical retaliation, physical consequence. This pacifism is what is disarming your nation and your children against their oppressors. The actual, if you wanted to use the term, against the bullies. Because you take away the means of defense. You're taking, you're telling the old saying from the Bible, the meek shall inherit the earth, refer to people who have a sword, know how to use it, but do not draw it unless they are being attacked or have to defend someone who is being attacked. Those are the meek. They shall inherit the earth because they know how to use violence, but refrain from using it until absolutely necessary. That is good pacifism. You could say heroic. It's not a martyr nonsense like this nonsense. This nonsense here is what takes away the sword from the meek. So the meek cannot defend, and the meek not himself and not anyone else. This is the creeping danger that destroys children in schools and that destroys nations as a whole. And thanks to George Orwell, I knew of this puzzle piece. I had already analyzed it, but I had not yet put it into this wider context. And now it makes all much more sense, especially since all of these types of teachers are, of course, not just women who do not even understand the violence, the rough and tumble play, the playful violence that boys especially need in order to figure out how much is even good and where's the line. But also driven by the left-wing ideology. As you will hardly find a conservative female teacher anywhere. They believe in the naive and enviable fantasy that you can solve everything with just words. And every narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian asshole will rub his or her hands about that. Because that means that no repercussions will ever come. And this creates a society where those with the biggest elbows win. Because no one who is not a psychopath, no one who is not a narcissist, no one who's not a Machiavellian, which is a term to talk about in some other section, for it vilifies Machiavelli, unjustified, but it describes the behavior of these people. It describes the behavior that Machiavelli described that you should be aware of in order to be able to defend against it. With this kind of pacifism pushed onto your children, society becomes the playground of the most vile monsters, the most remorseless, unempathetic, selfish monsters possible, because no one can stop them anymore. Because they will walk over everyone, including corpses. They will they will stomp over you, and they will stomp over your children and your grandchildren. These are the people who will become the dictators. These are the people who will build their secret societies to control everything and exploit everyone with no regard to any human life. These are the people who will build their organ farms. These are the people who will build 1984, Brave New World, or whatever else dystopian fantasy you can come up with every time. These are the people who live corruption. And it is up to you, it's up to our parents and to our children to stop them every generation. And we cannot do this if we keep falling into these psychological lies. Which means that it is up to the parents to wash this nonsense out of their children. Talk with your children about standing up for yourself, no matter what the teachers say, because the teachers can be wrong. Sorry for that rant. How long is this by now? Oh my god! Alright. Number 3. Negative nationalism. Example 1. Anglophobia. Within the intelligentsia, a derisive and mildly hostile attitude towards Britain is more or less compulsory, but it is an unfaked emotion in many cases. During the war, it was manifested in the defeatism of the intelligentsia, which persisted long after it had become clear that the Axis powers could not win. Many people were undisguisedly pleased when Singapore fell, or when the British were driven out of Greece. I believe I forgot a line here. I'm sorry. I'm not editing this. Where was I? During the war, it was manifested in a defeatism of the intelligentsia, which persisted long after it had become clear that the Axis powers could not win. Many people were undisguisedly pleased when Singapore fell or when the British were driven out of Greece. And there was a remarkable unwillingness to believe in good news. For example, El Alamein, or the number of German planes shot down in the Battle of Britain. English left-wing intellectuals did not, of course, actually want the Germans or Japanese to win the war. But many of them could not help getting a certain kick out of seeing their own country humiliated, and wanted to feel that the final victory would be due to Russia, or perhaps America, and not to Britain. Interjection. The same is true for the quite useless French resistance, but that is its own topic entirely. They all hoped, all these cells were at war with each other, and hoped that not that the Nazis won, but that they weakened France enough with the Allied forces then driving them out, so that France would be left in enough shambles so that they could take over and install their own version of communism. Which is quite hilarious, including that they were fighting over weapon caches dropped by Churchill's plans, which he then stopped because, well, the French resistance was more about fighting over those weapon caches with each other than actually using it to fight the Nazis. They were just stocking up for their hopeful revolution in the future. Back to the text. Wherever that was. In foreign politics, many intellectuals follow the principle that any faction backed by Britain must be in the wrong. As a result, enlightened opinion is quite largely a mirror image of conservative policy. Anglophobia is always liable to reversal. Hence that fairly common spectacle. The pacifist of one war who is a bellicist in the next. Example 2. Anti-Semitism. There is little evidence about this at present, because the Nazi persecutions have made it necessary for any thinking person to side with the Jews against their oppressors. Anyone educated enough to have heard the word anti-Semitism claims as a matter of course to be free of it, and anti-Jewish remarks are carefully eliminated from all classes of literature. Actually, anti-Semitism appears to be widespread, even among intellectuals, and the general conspiracy of silence probably helps to exacerbate it. People of left opinions are not immune to it, and their attitude is sometimes affected by the fact that Trotskyists and anarchists tend to be Jews. But anti-Semitism comes more naturally to people of conservative tendency, who suspect the Jews of weakening national morale and diluting the national culture. Neo-Tories and political Catholics are always liable to succumb to anti-Semitism, at least intermittently. Interjection. This was written in 1945. I am quite sure Orwell would be baffled into shock by the level of anti-Semitism that the left truly espouses, that socialists truly espouse. He would be... I think he would have to take a month-long break after reading the anti-Semitism report about the British Labour Party alone. Lucky for him, he never had to. Example 3. Trotskyism. The word is used so loosely as to include anarchists, democratic socialists, and even liberals. Democratic socialists are just socialists. Just bloody hell. I'm sorry, I need to make this interjection here. So it was also in 1945 that Walter Ulbricht, the architect and first chairman of Socialist East Germany, said, a democratic socialist, by the way, it must look democratic, but we must have it all in our hands. Which is the true definition of democratic socialism. It is just a paint job. It is just a Potemkin village, nothing else. It is a dictatorship. China is you could make the claim that China is a democratic socialism. Nobody has anything to say, but it looks like they have some sort of parliament where some votes are made, but well, it's not called a unity party without reason. The unity party votes in unison what the committee presents it, and the party is always right. So the committee is always right. It was the slogan of the Socialist Unity Party of East Germany. They had an anthem that went, the party is always right. It's not a joke. It's not a caricature. It's not comedy. It's reality. That's democratic socialism. You just have to get this across, because people still believe in this, because there's this little painting before the word socialist that says democratic. That's no. It is the literary version of a lanternfish. Back to Orwell. I use it here to mean a doctrinaire Marxist whose main motive is hostility to the Stalin regime. Trotskyism can be better studied in obscure pamphlets or in papers like the Socialist Appeal than in the works of Trotsky himself, who was by no means a man of one idea. Although in some places, for instance in the United States, Trotskyism is able to attract a fairly large number of adherents and develop into an organized movement with a petty Führer of its own. Its inspiration is essentially negative. And for the English listener, Orwell's little jab here with the word Führer is not wrong at all. He uses it as a jab. The whole joke is that the German word Führer, it means several things, but mainly its translations go into leader or guide. So every time a communist nation has a dear leader, that is nothing but a dear Führer. It is the exact same thing. So stop trying to say these things are in any way different, except in the details. But then all the communist regimes are different in the details. They're all personality cults. But I'm getting off topic. Back to reading. The Trotskyist is against Stalin, just as the communist is for him. And like the majority of communists, he wants not so much to alter the external world as to feel that the battle for prestige is going in his own favor. In each case, there is the same obsessive fixation on a single subject, the same inability to form a genuinely rational opinion based on probabilities. The fact that Trotskyists are everywhere a persecuted minority, and that the accusation usually made against them, for example, of collaborating with the fascists, is absolutely false, creates an impression that Trotskyism is intellectually and morally superior to communism. But it is doubtful whether there is much difference. The most typical Trotskyists, in any case, are ex-communists, and no one arrives at Trotskyism except via one of the left-wing movements. No communist, unless tethered to his party by years of habit, is secure against a sudden lapse into Trotskyism. The opposite process does not seem to happen equally often, though there is no clear reason why it should not. In the classification I have attempted above, it will seem that I have often exaggerated, oversimplified, made unwarranted assumptions, and have left out of account the existence of ordinarily decent motives. This was inevitable because in this essay I am trying to isolate and identify tendencies which exist in all our minds and pervert our thinking, without necessarily occurring in a pure state or operating continuously. It is important at this point to correct the oversimplified picture which I have been obliged to make. To begin with, one has no right to assume that everyone, or even every intellectual, is infected by nationalism. Secondly, nationalism can be intermittent and limited. An intelligent man may half succumb to a belief which attracts him, but which he knows to be absurd, and he may keep it out of his mind for long periods, only reverting to it in moments of anger or sentimentality, or when he is certain that no important issue is involved. Thirdly, a nationalistic creed may be adopted in good faith from non-nationalist motives. Fourthly, Several kinds of nationalism, even kinds that cancel out, can coexist in the same person. All the way through, I have said the nationalist does this or the nationalist does that, using for purposes of illustration the extreme, barely sane type of nationalist who has no neutral areas in his mind and no interest in anything except the struggle for power. Actually, such people are fairly common, but they are not worth powder and shot. In real life, Lord Elton, D.N. Pritt, Lady Houston, Ezra Pound, Lord Vansittart, Father Colin, and all the rest of their dreary tribe have to be fought against, but intellectual deficiencies hardly need pointing out. Monomania is not interesting, and the fact that no nationalist of the more bigoted kind can write a book which still seems worth reading after a lapse of years has a certain deodorizing effect. But when one has admitted that nationalism has not triumphed everywhere, that there are still people whose judgments are not at the mercy of their desires, the fact does remain that the pressing problems, India, Poland, Palestine, the Spanish Civil War, the Moscow trials, the American Negroes, the Russo-German Pact, or what have you, cannot be, or at least never are, discussed upon a reasonable level. The Eltons and Pritts and Collins, each of them simply an enormous mouth bellowing the same lie over and over again, are obviously extreme cases, but we deceive ourselves if we do not realize that we can all resemble them in unguarded moments. Let a certain note be struck, let this or that corn be trodden on, and it may be a corn whose very existence has been unsuspected hitherto. I never knew how to pronounce that. And a most fair-minded and sweet-tempered person may suddenly be transformed into a vicious partisan, anxious only to score over his adversary, and indifferent as to how many lies he tells or how many logical errors he commits in doing so. When Lloyd George, who was an opponent of the Boer War, announced in the House of Commons that the British communiques, if one added them together, claimed the killing of more Boers than the whole Boer nation contained, it is recorded that Arthur Balfour rose to his feet and shouted, "Cat!" Very few people are proof against lapses of this type. The Negro snubbed by a white woman, the Englishman who hears England ignorantly criticized by an American, the Catholic apologist reminded of the Spanish Armada, will all react in much the same way. One prod to the nerve of nationalism, and intellectual decencies can vanish. The past can be altered, and the plainest facts can be denied. If one harbors anywhere in one's mind a nationalistic loyalty or hatred, certain facts, although in a sense known to be true, are inadmissible. Here are just a few examples. I list below 5 types of nationalist, and against each I append a fact which it is impossible for that type of nationalist to accept, even in his secret thoughts. A British Tory cannot accept the fact that Britain will come out of, or idea or thought, that Britain will come out of this war with reduced power and prestige. The communist cannot, because I find this, I add to this because I find it hard to process just from the logic that is given. The communist is impossible to think if she had not been aided by Britain and America, Russia would have been defeated by Germany. The Irish nationalist cannot think either, can only remain independent because of British protection. The Trotskyist cannot think the Stalin regime is accepted by the Russian masses. The pacifist cannot think those who abjure violence can only do so because others are committing violence on their behalf. which is ironic because the pacifists described by Orwell here are usually the ones hoping for others to do their dirty work. All of these facts are grossly obvious if one's emotions do not happen to be involved. But to the kind of person named in each case, they are also intolerable, and so they have to be denied, and false theories constructed upon their denial. I come back to the astonishing failure of military prediction in the present war. It is, I think, true to say that the intelligentsia have been more wrong about the progress of the war than the common people, and that they were more swayed by partisan feelings. The average intellectual of the left believed, for instance, that the war was lost in 1940, that the Germans were bound to overrun Egypt in 1942, that the Japanese would never be driven out of the lands they had conquered, and that the Anglo-American bombing offensive was making no impression on Germany. He could believe these things because his hatred of the British ruling class forbade him to admit that British plans could succeed. There is no limit to the follies that can be swallowed if one is under the influence of feelings of this kind. I have heard it confidently stated, for instance, that the American troops had been brought to Europe not to fight the Germans but to crush an English revolution. One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool. When Hitler invaded Russia, the officials of the MOI issued, as background, a warning that Russia might be expected to collapse in 6 weeks. On the other hand, the communists regarded every phase of the war as a Russian victory, even when the Russians were driven back almost to the Caspian Sea and had lost several million prisoners. There is no need to multiply instances. The point is that as soon as fear, hatred, jealousy, and power worship are involved, the sense of reality becomes unhinged. And as I have pointed out already, the sense of right and wrong becomes unhinged also. There is no crime, absolutely none, that cannot be condoned when our side commits it. Even if one does not deny that the crime has happened. Even if one knows that it is exactly the same crime as one has condemned in some other cases. Even if one admits in an intellectual sense that it is unjustified. Still one cannot feel that it is wrong. Loyalty is involved. And so, pity ceases to function. The reason for the rise and spread of nationalism is far too big a question to be raised here. It is enough to say that, in the forms in which it appears among English intellectuals, it is a distorted reflection of the frightful battles actually happening in the external world, and that its worst follies have been made possible by the breakdown of patriotism and religious belief. He agrees with me. And what I interjected long before. So I read this before, but I forgot this part here. I should make some text markings at some point. If one follows up this train of thought, one is in danger of being led into a species of conservatism or into political quietism. It can be plausibly argued, for instance, it is even probably true, that patriotism is an inoculation against nationalism. That monarchy is the guard against dictatorship, and that organized religion is the guard against superstition. Now, some of these, I would say, demand long and deep discussion. I 100% agree on the patriotism as an inoculation against nationalism. And if you look at what was done in Germany for 2020 now, 70 years. For 70 years. For, let's say, 3/4 of a century, is that the left has equated patriotism with nationalism. You cannot be a patriot in this country without being called a nationalist, which equates instantly to being a Nazi. Because only Nazis are nationalists in the eyes of the left, and since patriotism is nationalism, a patriot is a Nazi. And nowadays you see the same logic repeated in the United States and other English-speaking countries, and of course others where Antifa spread out to like a metastasis. It is, if you think about how a cancer works, a cancer isn't just the growth of cells that is leaching resources. It's not just this parasitic thing. There is so much more going on with this. Like, the cancer sends out little corrupted cells that tell the immune system of the body, the T cells that come by and other cells, that there's nothing to see here. This is fine. This area is fine. Please go somewhere else. Cancer lowers the immune system around it, so that it won't be attacked. For a healthy immune system, destroys cancer cells wherever it comes across them. But I am almost through with the text, so back to that. Or again, it can be argued that no unbiased outlook is possible, that all creeds and causes involve the same lies, follies, and barbarities. And this is often advanced as a reason for keeping out of politics altogether. I do not accept this argument, if only because in the modern world no one describable as an intellectual can keep out of politics in the sense of not caring about them. I think one must engage in politics, using the word in a wide sense, and that one must have preferences. That is, one must recognize that some causes are objectively better than others, even if they are advanced by equally bad means. As for the nationalistic loves and hatreds that I have spoken of, they are part of the make-up of most of us, whether we like it or not. Whether it is possible to get rid of them, I do not know. But I do believe that it is possible to struggle against them, and that it is essentially a moral effort. It is a question, first of all, of discovering what one really is, what one's own feelings are, and then of making allowance for the inevitable bias. Interjection: this is exactly the thing that a narcissist is cognitively, maybe physiologically, unable to do. If you hate and fear Russia, if you are jealous of the wealth and power of America, if you despise Jews, if you have a sentiment of inferiority towards the British ruling class, you cannot get rid of those feelings simply by taking thought. But you can at least recognize that you have them and prevent them from contaminating your mental processes. The emotional urges, which are inescapable and are perhaps even necessary to political action, should be able to exist side by side with an acceptance of reality. But this, I repeat, needs a moral effort, and contemporary English literature, so far as it is alive at all to the major issues of our time, shows how few of us are prepared to make it. That is that. And as a final commentary on this last part especially, what Orwell is describing here in his last paragraph sounds a lot like the lefts, the radical lefts, the communists' version of... I'm struggling for words here, so I'm sorry if the sentence is butchered. When I talk about unconscious bias and everybody's racist and justifying their struggle sessions, these things sound similar to what Orwell just said. There's a key difference, however. Orwell describes the process of a mature human reflecting upon himself and his thoughts. For example, in meditation, but also in general. What the left is doing is a twisted, corrupted version of this in order to brainwash, to guilt trip and to brainwash. And that is not a process. For what Orwell describes as a process of maturation. What the left does is a process of immaturation, of dematuration. It infantilizes. It breaks. It is the opposite of therapy, if you will. Good therapy, that is. But yes, this is the first essay in Notes on Nationalism. The second essay is Anti-Semitism in Britain, which is somewhat useful to the topic. And the third one is the sporting spirit, a very short one that explores the topic on the example of sports, and especially during the times of war. But it is another topic. All right. If you got through to the end, thanks for listening, taking the time. Get back to me about what you thought about the content. I hope the sound is good enough. I again apologize for my many interjections. They're also in part for myself, for I have trouble writing things down lately, if you will. And I bid you farewell and hope for good conversation.